Hi everyone, today I'm going to be doing my March wrap-up. Once again, I've set up completely by myself. My husband is out, so anything that's wrong with the video or the audio is completely my fault. I just tried to go start the audio recording in Pro Tools and I pressed all the wrong buttons first, so I think it's recording right now. Let's start off with some statistics. So I finished 11 books in March, which I would say is good, but like fairly average for me. Generally, I read between about 8 to 12 books on a typical month, depending on the length of the books and also just my mood. I also tend to start off strong every month and then sort of go off TBR, off script, lose track of what I'm doing as the month goes on. That definitely, I think, happened this month. But also, I didn't really do a TBR in March because I was doing some cleanup from my February TBR because I don't know. I don't remember what happened in February, but apparently I was busy and I didn't finish reading all the books I wanted to read, but I still wanted to read them, so I read them in March instead. So other than those 11 books I finished, I did have one DNF, which I'll talk about. I only DNF, I only don't finish few books a year. If I start a book and put it down after 10, 15, 20 pages because I'm just not in the mood, I just pretend that didn't happen. That's not a DNF to me. So there are only a few books a year that I really decide to stop reading when I'm a significant amount of the way through. And I'll talk about that. Out of those 11 books that I finished, we had 8 fantasy, fairly typical for me, 1 science fiction, 1 nonfiction, and 1 classic. And then 2 of those books were actually audiobooks. The rest I read either physically in print or, on ebook in some form. Overall, it was a pretty solid month. I liked a lot of what I read. There were some really outstanding books this month. I feel like it was a better reading month maybe than January and February in terms of reading things that I just really loved. So I'll do my usual thing with this wrap up. I'll talk about books from my least favorite all the way up through my most favorite, generally in order as I'm feeling that order today. As you guys may know, if you've watched me before, I don't give star ratings to books. I just talk about how I felt about them. So let's start off with the DNF. The book that I didn't finish, and I put it down about 40% of the way through, was Fires of Vengeance by Evan Winter. This is the sequel to Rage of Dragons. I honestly haven't been keeping track of how people have been receiving the sequel in general. I think generally people that really liked Rage of Dragons also really liked Fires of Vengeance. I was just in kind of a weird place with Rage of Dragons. I appreciated a lot of what it was doing. I liked that it was African inspired, and it actually did keep me up late at night reading, which is something that doesn't happen to me so often these days. But on the other hand, I didn't love the main character. I just didn't really connect with the story that much emotionally, even though it was very exciting. And the whole thing was kind of one big long fight scene. And while I like action, it was like a level of action that's beyond the amount of action that I personally want to read. But I totally understood why people really liked that book, and it did feel really fresh. It felt original. I think it's awesome that it was a self-publishing success story that got picked up by traditional publishing. There's a lot to like about Rage of Dragons, and I did overall enjoy reading it, even though I did also kind of have the sense that it wasn't for me. So I was intending to read Fires of Vengeance, but as soon as I started, I finally got to the book, and I started reading it, and I just kind of knew that I was like, oh yeah, this is not for me. I was having a hard time remembering who everyone was, which is something that I usually don't struggle with unless I really just don't care. I still just didn't care that much about Tao, the main character. I wasn't connecting to the book at all, and that's usually why I put down a book. It's not that necessarily that it's a bad book. The books that I DNF are usually books where it's just so profoundly feeling like it's not for me that I just physically can't make myself keep going. So what happened with Fires of Vengeance is I really wasn't feeling it, but I intended to read this. I was gonna power through. I kept reading, and then we started getting some cool, some interesting hints about reveals that were coming. So that kind of hooked me, I'd say from about 15% to 40%. And then when some of those, or maybe like the main reveal came, and I kind of felt like, oh, that's cool. And then I just had nothing that interested me about the book anymore, so I stopped. But I have nothing against this series in general. It's not that I don't think it's good. It just isn't working for me, and for some reason the first book was able to kind of sustain me through something that wouldn't typically be my taste, and then by the time I got to the second one it was just kind of over for me, and I don't think I will continue reading the series. But there's plenty I admire about these books. I really like how the main character's sort of skill and special abilities come more from his determination and his training rather than something he was born with. Probably my least favorite book that I read this month was All the Murmuring Bones by A.G. Slatter. This is a book that I requested as an ARC, so that's kind of on me. I did do a full dedicated review of it, although it's quite short, so I'll link to that if you're curious. This is a dark, gothic, Irish fairy tale set in a secondary world that the author has apparently written some short stories in before. This was, I think, the biggest element of where the story just didn't work for me was actually the secondary world setting and just some stuff with that. I felt like it was a perfectly decent dark gothic fairy tale if that's what you're in the mood for. It didn't really hold me, but it was short, it was fine. That was just probably the book I was the least into this month. Next, apparently following a theme of me thinking that I'm into fairy tales but then not loving it, Stardust by Neil Gaiman. I actually quite liked this book, so I guess this really was a good reading month for me. There are a lot I liked about Stardust. It just kind of left me in the end more with a neutral feeling rather than an excitement to go out and read more Neil Gaiman. I picked this up because I hadn't read any Neil Gaiman since I read American Gods in my teens and was kind of traumatized by that book, and I felt like it was time to give Neil Gaiman another shot, and I thought this kind of fairy tale for grown-ups would be something I would like, and overall I did think it was quite clever. He strikes this quite childlike, whimsical tone and then throws some really dark stuff in there. So I enjoyed it. I read it very quickly. I think it's a nice book. It wasn't anything special for me. I didn't have any special reaction to it. I actually did go and watch the movie with my husband after I read this. We enjoyed it. It's a pretty silly, campy fantasy movie where they went really more in the whimsical, absurd humor direction rather than the dark fairy tale direction. I think it worked well. I think Neil Gaiman was pretty involved with the movie, and I think from what we've seen with his work on the Good Omens TV show, I think he definitely seems to have a good head for screenwriting, how to adapt stuff for film, all that stuff. So yeah, I really liked Stardust. It just left me a little, it was fine. I wouldn't particularly recommend or not recommend it. I'm still open to continuing to try more Neil Gaiman, but I have this feeling maybe he's just not an author for me. I listened to an audio novella this month called The Original, which was a collaboration between Brandon Sanderson and Mary Robinette Kowal. It was about 4 hours long, I think. So this was something they co-wrote, and it was intended, I think it was done by Audible, but I'm not sure, but it was an audio-only book, which I was curious to check out. I know Brandon Sanderson is branching out more into audiobook production. I also know Mary Robinette Kowal has done a lot of theater and audio work herself, so I was really curious how their two styles would combine as well and who I would sense. I think if I had to guess, just based on the final product, I found it to be more Mary Robinette Kowal than Brandon Sanderson, but in a good way. I like her writing in general. Sometimes I don't totally connect to it, but I've really enjoyed her Lady Astronaut series. One of the things that's kind of a hallmark of her writing to me is she has these really strong relationships, usually between her central female character and a husband or partner. It's something that I think she consciously writes, and these relationships are often very different from each other, but there is usually a relationship that has this really strong bond and is usually somewhat complex and isn't just sort of a typical marriage or typical relationship that can be kind of written off. It's usually a core to the characters and who they are. That element was a huge part of this story. It was a science fiction, kind of a noir feel where in this futuristic world, almost everything is basically artificial, where characters are viewing the world through these themes basically, and people can be cloned and brought back if they die. They basically save themselves to the cloud every so often. But our main character wakes up in a hospital in the beginning, and she realizes that she is not a clone that has been brought back of, herself who died. She's actually a duplicate of her original, and her original is wanted for the murder of their husband in really unknown circumstance. So this clone has been created with only a few days to live to hunt down her original and try to bring her to justice for the murder of her husband. So it's a very emotionally complex story. It was pretty exciting to listen to. I am still not sure how I felt about the ending, but I don't really want to say too much more than that. I definitely enjoyed it. It was shorter than the kinds of things I usually read. I thought the world was well fleshed out. It was definitely a little bit dystopian. It's not something I would have picked up necessarily if it wasn't for the names of the authors, but if you are an audiobook listener, I would definitely recommend this one. I mean, it's short and enjoyable. Since it was done as an audio production, there was some extra music and some sound effects, things like that. Overall, if you want to listen to a 4-hour audiobook by Mary Robinette, Kowal, and Brandon Sanderson, I'd recommend it. It's not going to be an all-time favorite, but it was definitely exciting if you like some noir, thriller, detective-y, science fiction, futuristic stuff. So in March, I read Persuasion by Jane Austen for the first time. I thought this was the only Jane Austen I hadn't read. Turns out I also haven't read Northanger Abbey. Oops, I kind of forgot about that one, but I've read all the other ones. And I've heard a lot of people say that Persuasion is their favorite Jane Austen, so I was expecting to love this. I read it along with my best friend, and both of us felt weirdly neutral to it. I watched a movie from the 90s of it, and I felt neutral to that too, and I usually love Jane Austen. I have no real complaints about this book. It had a lot of the things that I generally enjoy in Jane Austen. I guess my only complaint, I just wasn't really feeling the central relationship between the characters. The main character, you feel sorry for her, but I found her hard to love, but I don't know. If this is your favorite Jane Austen book, please comment down below and tell me what you love about it, because I've seen so many people love this book, and I just failed to connect to it, and that shocked me. Race the Sands by Sarah Beth Durst was a book I picked out of the magic hat for my February TBR. It was recommended by a viewer, and I thought this was a really fun read. I did a dedicated review of this one. Really, my only complaint about this book is that I found the writing style to be a little more direct and colloquial than I typically like in a fantasy book, but this is just such a fun fantasy take on a classic sports underdog story. You can watch my review if you're curious about how that works, but I read this in an evening. It was a really fun, light, enjoyable read. I think if it wasn't for my issues with the style, it really would have been a total win for me. And also, I guess it did what it was intended to do, but my personal preference is for books that sink a little bit more into the world building, flesh things out a little bit more. This is not really what this book was intended to do. I think it fulfilled its purpose. But yeah, those were the things that would have made me love it more. But just as a light, fun fantasy interlude, definitely enjoyed this. Then I read Magic for Nothing, which is the 6th InCryptid book by Seanan McGuire. I've been gradually making my way through this series. This is also a very not a serious series. The books are quite goofy at times. They are about this family of cryptozoologists who are fighting against an order called the Order of St. George that wants to kill all, monsters and supernatural creatures. And meanwhile, this family, the Price family, wants to protect the supernatural creatures, but they're also intervening between the supernatural and humanity in order to sort of keep things calm. So it's a series that has tended to have a bit more of a monster of the week type plot, a large, wacky, colorful cast of characters, and just a lot of sass and goofy humor. Book 6 was interesting because the series is actually starting to have a little bit more of an overarching plot. I think there's 10 of them out so far, and in book 6, for the first time, we're following the youngest sibling in the family, Antimony, or Annie as she's known. She definitely feels like a bit of the odd one out among her siblings. She hasn't really found herself yet. She's also dealing with some magic that she has, which is not typical, and she doesn't really know how to deal with that or keep it under control. She keeps starting to light things on fire by accident, and basically she is called into this situation where she needs to go undercover because she is the only one in the family who can do it because of some decisions that her family has made. She's a character that we haven't seen too much before this, and she wasn't presented that sympathetically by her older siblings when we did see her from their points of view. So I was surprised by how much I actually kind of liked her in this book. She's a lot different from her own point of view than the way her siblings see her, and she still does have a bit of a moody teenage vibe at times, but also I definitely sympathized with her, and I enjoyed reading from her perspective a lot. I definitely enjoyed the turn that the series has taken in this book. More than the others, even this felt like it was part one of a arc with this character, so I'm gonna have to keep reading to find out how I feel about it. I was just surprised by how much I liked this one. I was kind of expecting to not enjoy Annie's point of view at all. I keep doing this thing where I read Wheel of Time books over in between the months, so I finished this at the beginning of March, I think. I've kind of lost track now. I don't think I talked about it in my February wrap-up. If I did, I probably hadn't finished it yet by then. I've done 2 videos about my Wheel of Time journey with The Great Hunt. I did one review reaction video that's basically spoiler-free, and then I did my first ever vlog where I filmed myself as I read and sort of recorded some spoilery thoughts. So if you want to know my thoughts about the Wheel of Time, really recommend you watch the other 2 videos that I made about it. I'll link to those down below. The 2-second version, yes, I definitely liked this more than The Eye of the World, and the pacing was much better. One of the first books that I read in March was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. She is the author of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which has been a very long time since I read, but I really, really liked it when I did read it. Piranesi is a very, very different book from that one. It is extremely short and quite confusing. It's told from the point of view of journal entries, and I wish I'd made some notes to myself now about this book because I'm not sure how to talk about it, but I really, really liked it. I definitely enjoy being thrown into a confusing situation in a book where I don't quite understand what the scenario is and gradually coming to understand it through what's going on. Basically, our main character seems to have no memory of his previous life. He's living in this thing he calls a house, but it's huge and filled with water and giant statues, and it seems to go on forever, and it's just this really weird, alternate dimension reality thing. There's one other person in there with him who, as far as he knows, is the only other person that exists, and he is just exploring this house, and gradually more of the plot starts to get revealed and more of the backstory, and we learn more about what's going on. It's a really beautiful, surprisingly touching book. I wish I had spent more time with it, but it is quite short. I have heard that the audiobook is extremely good, and I would actually like to reread this book soon and listen to it because I feel like it's the kind of book that would be really enjoyable to be immersed in and listen to the audiobook and get to spend a little more time with it because of the pace of the audiobook. So that's something I would definitely like to do soon. The next book I read is one, oh, that is shiny. Let's see. Okay. This book, which I'm trying to get to be less shiny, Peak Performance by Brad Stulberg and Steve Magness. This is a book that my husband picked. He had read it before. It was for a nonfiction book club we're doing for something professional, but I hadn't read it, so I had to read it so I could be part of the discussion. I usually avoid the kinds of nonfiction my husband reads. It's not because I don't like it, it's because he summarizes it so very well and also tells me about it in great detail when he's listening to the audiobooks. But I loved this book. If you like sort of science-based self-improvement kinds of books, really highly recommend this. It was an easy and quick read. The main point of this book is really, it's called Peak Performance. It's about stress and rest and about how we both need to sort of push ourselves and stress ourselves in the right way, and then also to rest in the right way in order to reach our potential. And this could really apply to anything. I'm a classical musician, as is my husband, but this is something, there are tips in here that anybody could apply to their life. So I thought it was really interesting, and also just it kind of put me in a place of wanting to be productive, which is the effect that consuming self-improvement content has on us. Sometimes it's not even so much about what you learn from it, it's just about the fact that it gets you kind of hyped up to accomplish things. So definitely, if you're interested in this kind of nonfiction, I really enjoyed this. Other than Peak Performance, I had 2 other favorite books this month. Really hard to pick between them, but I'm just gonna have to go in some sort of order. So I finally finished listening to The Wall of Storms by Ken Liu. I'm not kidding. This audiobook took me like 2+ months to listen to. I took a really long break in the middle to listen to some Dorothy Sayers mysteries because I was just finding Wall of Storms to be a little intense emotionally, and I could tell bad stuff was coming and I didn't want to hear it, so I just took like 3 weeks off the book. Don't think that I didn't love the book. I loved this book. I just made my husband listen to Grace of Kings. Our friend Daniel just started it too. I'm really into this series right now. I just think what Ken Liu has done is amazing. I haven't talked about these books too much on the channel. I kind of regret that I didn't review Grace of Kings when I read it last summer. I was in the middle of my Hugo's stuff, I think. But my plan is before book 3 comes out, which I think is going to be in November, I'll probably reread Grace of Kings and Wall of Storms physically, and then just maybe talk a little bit more about them on the channel then, I guess. We'll see. This series is very different than most of the fantasy that's out there, and I don't think it will be for everyone, but I personally have really loved it. I've really loved what Ken Liu has created in this series. I was blown away by where he took book 2 after what happened in book 1. Whatever I was expecting, it wasn't that. And then also the way the first half of the book is set up, it's almost like the second half of The Wall of Storms is a totally different book. It just goes in this totally different direction, and it really does feel like reading history. I mean, it feels like reading history in a good way, where the way things work out is just not neat, and sometimes it seems like one thing is the issue, and then this other outside issue comes along, and it's way more of a problem. So I am really loving what Ken Liu is creating in the Dandelion Dynasty series, and I hope I'll talk about it more. Other than Wall of Storms, I think my favorite book that I read in March for sure was The Hod King by Josiah Bancroft. Each time I finished one of the books in this series, I kind of waited before reading the next one. I think I kept being afraid I'd be let down by the sequel. So far, hasn't happened. I think The Hod King might be my favorite book yet, but it's really hard to say. Senlin Ascends is definitely the most narrowly focused and also the weirdest and most confusing, probably out of all 3. Books 2 and 3 feel a little bit more like you have this epic feel, you understand what the series is about, but I continue to just adore the character work in this series. I really care about most of the characters so much. I love the way Josiah Bancroft writes, and I cried while reading this book. I was on the edge of my seat. I stayed up way too late finishing it. I think if you're reading this series, I don't think you'll find book 3 to be a letdown at all. Now that I'm caught up, I have to wait until book 4 comes out later this year, so that's kind of rough. But I just have loved this series so much. It really has been one of my favorite things that I've read in the past year, and it is just so unique. His writing is so good. It's really just a very different kind of thing than a lot of what's out there, and I love that. So that's my wrap up of everything I read in March. I have plenty to work on for my April TBR, so I had better get going on that. But thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, how much you disagreed with me for DNFing Fires of Vengeance. I want to hear all of it, so let me know.